Tito Georgina Munoz and Romulo Torres, co-chairs of Latindadd, and Natalie Begin, who is also a member of the Coordination Committee for Prosecution Justice, so they can give us their opening remarks to this event. Please, Romina, Romulo, Natalie, please, you can come forward, and you have a couple minutes. Well, good morning everyone. Welcome to this new conference of Latindadd, co-organized by the Network of Prosecution of Justice, and let me also welcome you as Peruvian, welcome everyone that comes from abroad. It's a real pleasure to us to have this physical encounter after the pandemic of COVID-19, and that didn't allow us to see each other for a while, even though we've been working virtually through Zoom. We wanted to make this physical meeting, let's say, because we want to strengthen the ties, and we want to work around the different topics of crises that we will talk about today. It's important to acknowledge that the proposals that we will talk about won't be able to be solved or faced just by the work of one or two networks. We need a huge or grander organization so we can face these subjects from the civil society. So in that sense, I hope that we can all have a good day of work, and I hope that these personal encounters we can actually share what we lived through and what are we feeling and what is the feeling of our countries and what is the way of how are we going to face these complex challenges that we'll talk about today in this meeting. Thank you. Good morning everyone. Good morning to our special guests, members of Latindadd. Actually, the world is living a really grave time. We cannot carry on this way. Basically, we need urgent actions, immediate and extraordinary actions that will answer to this pandemic situation, to this crisis or war situation that we're living worldwide. Really, one thing is what the policy or politics say, and the other thing is the reality of it. We can see how if financial growth that's concentrated, it makes rich people richer and poor people poorer. We see how this growth of concentration of richness is in few hands only again, and the pandemic has been a product of that result, benefiting this sector. We've talked a lot about since 2020 that we are in a new reality, that we need to restart, that we need to recover. And what does recovery mean for us, at least? For those that work day in and out, those that are out in the streets, the outcast. What does the war mean? What does the climate crisis mean? What does the food crisis implicate, or the crisis that we have basically is overlapping our debt? That's also a crisis by itself. So that's why it's necessary to have a schedule, an agenda that will give any answer to these multiple crises that we have. Basically, these people that talk about recovery, they don't see or they don't want to answer to who is nurturing this inequality. Where can these conditions can be found? Who's establishing them for us to undertake new changes, new processes of inclusive development even? So Latin America is living now a moment of proposal, mobilization, of demands, but we do require fundamentally for new governments, new progressive governments that are being established in the region. They need to assume and establish a policy that would obliterate this type of crisis through transformational events that will respond to these subjects of change. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here on behalf of the Coordination Council for the Prosecution Justice of Latin America. I'm really happy, like Romulo and Georgina mentioned, to be here and to be able to touch you and to hug you and not having a screen in front of me or that separates us anymore, that doesn't allow us to look back at each other. So this contact is incredible. Like Carlos said, we will have a couple of really intense days. We are over 50 people that will speak in different panels in 4 different areas, like Carlos mentioned: prosecution justice, new financial architecture, transformational technologies, and regional integration. And as Romulo and Georgina mentioned as well, beyond diagnosis and analysis, it would be good for us to end up with concrete proposals to step out of this crisis. And that's what we are hoping and waiting for as a network. And so that's why we wish you all a good day of work. Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie, Georgina, Romulo. And now we will open with our first panel, our opening panel for the conference. The hardest part of the pandemic between 2020 and 2021 meant death and misery for millions of people in our continent. We have lowered it, and we've been taking up on ourselves with over 30% of death of the world due to this event. And we are the region that got into a debt in its greatest amount in the region, because now we feel and we know that the richest people in the neighborhood, so to speak, are now richer. So that this whole situation made Rita Segaro think that the word inequality is not enough to establish a difference between rich and poor people, but actually invites us to talk about seniorship in a world of owners. And if we have to talk about going to bad to war, from bad to worse, the start of the war in February 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine from Russia affects our Americas strongly in the middle of a geopolitical discussion that's even greater. Western and Eastern warfare, basically. The North American presence in the China island Formosa is another landmark of the open conflict in a world that seems to transit through bipolarity, despite the strong establishment that the USA is putting ourselves food as wheat, soy, and with the fertilizer scarcity as put our crops in a harsh situation, not just because of the pandemic, but because of a structure of inequality, environmental damage, or harm caused by colonial capitalism and the patriarchal order. That's why the challenges that we live through are not only financial, social, but also rather multidimensional and intersectorial, and as we mentioned a while ago, especially geopolitical. It means that at all levels, is the sustainability of life in the planet, the one that's at play. And not just because of climate change, but we need to imagine the defeat of the collective imperialism of the Occident will end up in a nuclear winter, as Manolo Monedero warns us, would be surrealistic if it wasn't because of 2020. A pandemic would keep us basically all in the entire world locked up at home. But what can we do then? The objective of this part has been to gather Atilio, Emilia, Ariela, because their vision from the policy, feminism, the educational world, social activism, they all complement each other quite well to establish a framework in the context also that will get us and allow us to deepen in each and one of the core themes that I mentioned. And despite the geopolitical problems that we are living through nowadays, and the hegemonic disputes in between Russia, China, and the war itself, we have many regional elements in this context that will invite you to consider. For example, the ultra-right-wingization of anti-right people, the response of social and political movements, especially from feminism and the bet on the care and the feminist economy and diversity itself, the global opportunities that are opening themselves up to win in sovereign and rights in time of crisis. The pandemic and its consequences, the relationships north and south, the huge climate challenges, transitions in energetic matrices, and new beds of life, like living nice and rich, like the financial and social crisis, the rise of fuel, scarcity of fertilizers, scarcity of food that we also mentioned, the political processes in Latin America, the new wave of progressive governments or administration, whatever we want to call them in their diversity, Colombia, Chile, etc. And especially the challenges in the current context, the political turn in Latin America and the political crisis as well in the region. We are in a country that receives us all in a strong political crisis that just started not just now but many years ago. The evil part of the monetary fund in the region, the food crisis, energy crisis, the huge social inequality, the accelerated rhythm of accumulation of richness of rich people and a lack of fair taxing, regional integrations, the new relation between Colombia and Venezuela, the media power, the media after or the post-truth, the fake news, hybrid warfare, etc. In addition, it's a really general panel, and our panelists have the freedom of establishing their own general vision, specific as well of the context, thinking about the region and in the global context. So we can start out with the first general question for our panel. What are the aspects of the multiple crises or of the current context highlight the most, facing the political consequences, financial and social that they involve, and the stakeholders subject that move or should move? Where are we heading as a region? Each and one of you will have 20 minutes in our first round, and then we'll go to public, our members of the audience interventions, and then a response between 8 to 10 minutes. So without any further ado, we start with Atilio Aworu. Atilio is a sociologist, politologist, and master in political science by Flaxo from Santiago, Chile, and a PhD in the Harvard University, also vice dean of the University of Buenos Aires, and executive secretary of Flaxo, which is the Latin American Council of Social Sciences. Currently directs the complementation cycle of Latin American history in the Department of Culture, Arts, and Journalism of the University of Avellaneda. And he conducts the Latin American program of late distance education of the Florial Gorini Mutual Funds, a consultation professor of the University of Buenos Aires, and a researcher, a superior researcher from CONICET. Among its most recent books, Latin American Geopolitical Imperialism, The Wizard of the Tribe, Vargas Llosa, and the Liberalism Latin America, the Dream of the Migration. These last two books will be presented on Wednesday in the Virrey bookstore at 6 p.m. with Atilio's presence there. His academic analysis and journalism work can be followed on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and his YouTube channel, and his website at atilioboron.com. Please, Atilio, you have 20 minutes. All right, thank you very much, Carlos. It's a real pleasure to be in this city again, being in an event organized by these two friend institutions, and I'll try to take some of the questions or the big challenges that are established or have been presented at the start of this panel. What can Latin America do? What can we do, right? As a social strength, a social force, as a social movement in a world that's changing in such an accelerated manner. Carlos mentioned Manuel Monedero, right? In his analysis about the transition of the systemic character where we are on now. We are at a really special time of history because the old world order, and when I say the old world order, I'm talking about the one that was established basically from the beginning or from the end of the Second World War. They had two great periods. The first one was the rise of bipolarism, where we had two huge blocks of power that some were referring to as a free world, even though we were deep in dictatorships, but we were part of the free world led by the US and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union crumbled apart, the wall collapsed, and then we had a second stage of this period that started at the end of World War II, which was a North American bipolarism, a fantasy, some sort of dream, like Brzezinski mentioned, that wasn't precisely a left-wing criticism of North American imperialism, but this bipolarism doesn't have any conditions of lasting. It cannot last. That makes it a transitory or temporary phenomenon. And of course, some years after the bipolarism, we saw the falling apart of the Berlin Wall and the implosion of the Soviet Union, and we saw different foundations and groups of work being formed for big projects, talking about the new North American century, where they say we are not going to have any more rivals, and now the U.S. will be able to reach their goal, and the mission was put upon providence by God, I guess, of carrying freedom and justice and this kingdom of peace and freedom. But at the end or at the beginning of 21st century, we saw some concerning symptoms that give us the true lights of this world, built as an empire where we can all see it, and we saw different factors that concern us and that shined some light on this, like the appearance of Argentina in the world economy. When I say unexpected appearance, because I remember one of these events that took place in Buenos Aires at the end of the 80s, where Lester Suro, one of the most brilliant economists of the U.S., did a whole forecast and diagnose a worldwide economy, and there we were able to see a tri-way order. That's this way where U.S., the European Union, and Japan were the pillars. And we're talking about the 80s, but China wasn't appearing in the screen at the moment. And when we asked them, because there were people concerned about that, looking that China was coming, and what this huge economist said was that, yeah, China will come, but they won't get there before 2030. Well, China took the fast track, and they got there at the beginning of the 21st century, and that was the huge surprise. Everyone was just amazed how this happened, and the other huge surprise was that, at least a surprise for those that were looking at it as only a general idea of thinking that one of the countries that was one of the main cores of international politics for 2.5 centuries, I'm talking about Russia, because it had crumbled the Soviet Union. Now they thought that that country wasn't counting anymore. That was a belief that was spread out in the 80s, that was fed somehow by the poor management that Gorbachev did of the political transition and financial transition from the Soviet Union to Russia, thinking that, well, Russia was already a stakeholder that was not going to interfere in worldwide matters, forgetting completely that for 250 years they were one of the key actors, the stakeholders, and even had the scale in their own hands. And then Russia came back from a really polemic type of character, Putin, who reset Russia as a first-level stakeholder in worldwide politics, especially in the most immediate area of influence, which is Europe and the Mediterranean area. We need to remember that the intervention of Russia in Syria, which was, among other things, requested by Barack Obama's administration itself, that got themselves into a hustle and they didn't know how to get out of it. So these two elements were the two main surprises of the beginning of the century, but they overlap and they jump on a slow process of decrease of the U.S. as an hegemonic power. And the agreement, or academic agreement, was that this was left aside because the educational or academical world is a plurality type of world, but when you go afar from the main idea, really quickly those ideas are shut up and marginated and left aside, isolated, and they're not that discussed. So there were people that said, take a look, because US is staying behind the technological race, and that's not something that a Latin American that was overwhelmed said it, but it was the Center of Research on Competitiveness on the U.S. This is a private organization that makes analysis about the competitiveness that different contexts and different parts of the market of the U.S. has worldwide. And in the mid-90s was also mentioned that the main markets in the U.S., they were falling behind, and they had to do with artificial intelligence, informatics, robotics, and all that. So in the paper, Carlos, I will quote it precisely so you can take a look at this information. And they were saying that technological race was going to have a really huge impact in the capacity of the U.S. of organizing this international system, because as you know, the U.S. is mentioned, or they establish themselves as the leaders of the world, and that's laughable at the very least, because their leadership is basically founded with blood, and we have a problem here, I guess, with the mic. Thank you.
This may sound like laughing stock, but you may wonder what is all this based on. And it's based on the presumed political, economic, technological, moral superiority of the United States. I invite you to look at a number of the foreign affairs journal. That's the diplomatic and academic, diplomatic. Let me take that back. Journal of the U.S. establishment. Joe Biden was invited to write an article for the journal 6 months before he was elected, and he was asked what he was supposed to do, he's planning to do for the world order, and he said that he planned to bring all the world leaders to a round table presided by the United States to establish the new economic, financial, and political rules that would be laid down to build a new world order. Juan Guaido was invited on behalf of Venezuela and the president of Venezuela, and this is no accident, and that's because at that time Biden said that the world's divide was not between capitalism and communism. He held that capitalism had already spread its ideas of happiness, but that rather now it was the great divide was autocracy and democracy. Nancy Pelosi just said that sitting right across the straits between Taiwan and China was a great autocracy. Now, let me get back to the book that I just mentioned, and to say that the dominance of the United States can no longer be taken for granted. The competitive sensitive indicators and several others point to the fact that clearly the U.S. has lost its technological competitiveness advantage, and the international order's hegemony has as one of its components precisely financial, economic, and technology advantages. The U.S. is no longer the world's most important larger power, like it or not. Whether we like or not its political regime, the world's leader is China, not during its apogee as the supremes, the world supremes or world comer, when the U.S. was the main financial and trade partner of 144 countries right after the Second World War, like China is today. And China is the country that buys and invests most. And that is clearly obvious. That's clear, for instance, in the sub-Saharan Africa. Where when you go to the countries there, you will see that street and road signs are written in the local language, whatever it will be, and in Chinese. And that clearly shows how the U.S. has lost gradually in this race. And somebody that said it very clearly a little before the pandemic was none other than Jimmy Carter. You cannot say that he is a Sinophile. No, he has been he is a very religious man. He's a Baptist member in Plains in Georgia, and he was invited by the local pastor to a Sunday sermon, and that is a very typical practice in those churches, the Baptist church. And at that talk, he said that we must take into account that the almost 250 years of independent U.S., only in 19 years out of those 250 will not engage in some kind of war, foreign war, or send the troops to foreign lands. And of course that in Carter's reasoning clearly, what we are witnessing is that China is taking the lead in the technological race during many years of our own history. Our knowledge, wisdom, and money was devoted to war. And the Chinese were using those resources to move forward. And let me give you some figures. For every engineer that gets a diploma in the U.S., 6 Chinese people get an engineering diploma. It used to be like a 1-on-1 ratio. Now it is 1 American for every 6 Chinese graduates. And what does that result in? In very high, advanced, cutting-edge technology patents. In Argentina, we're still trying to put in place a 4G mobile technology. In China, they already have 5G technology installed, and they are on the verge of launching 6G technology. In the U.S., there's no way they can compete with Chinese technology, and the reason for that is that they do not have a registered patent for this technology for the last 10 years. Until 2014, China filled a place as the second position behind the U.S. But after 2015, Chinese has taken a huge leap forward and has registered every year 30,000 to 35,000 patents, while the U.S. still registers like 15,000, which is the same figure of registered patents that they had since around 2015. And this should, how much time I have left? 5 minutes, okay. So this is what should provide the backdrop. I was going to use an English word, but I decided not to, in Spanish, of course. And to understand this new type of breakdown of the world order, which is not order. I'd rather use the word scenario, because if there is something that was lacking, there was order. It was just accumulation of international practices that were not well organized. But if there is something that we can see now is that there's a very clear intention in many documents of the U.S. that this old order has to be rebuilt, and to do that, there's, however, two major barriers. The first one is China, and that is a fundamental barrier, and that's why our friend Modera, that was quoted by Caro, said that the problem was not Russia, the issue is China. And I totally agree with that, because China, that was National Security Council documents as the enemy, and this is not just an adjective. In the Ukraine war, that was very carefully planned by the United States. And if you look at some documents, like, for instance, the RAND Corporation document in this issue, that dates back to 2019, before the pandemic, by the way, shows clearly what was going to happen there. It is like the script of a theater play. And just to mention one issue that is mentioned in that thesis, is that we have to get Russia to overexpand itself and get involved in a war. And to do that, we have to place some lethal weapons in Ukraine. It's a provocation that has led to the Russian response, about which I would like to talk in more detail later. But why Russia? Because a fundamental ally of China, and because China is the maximum strategic objective target, is to weaken Russia, and once that happens, China will fall into a trap by reacting impulsively to the U.S. offensive. That is abetted by almost all European governments, to much their shame, that have decided to become pawns of the U.S. strategic design. Like, for instance, what does NATO have to do in the Indo-Pacific area, as was decided in the latest NATO summit in Madrid. Once Russia and China are eliminated, we're going to be moving into the best of all worlds, where the U.S., as in a Netflix or Hollywood movie, will be a world of peace, happiness, and prosperity for all. That is what we see in Western media. And here I will finish. If you want to understand what's happening in the West, stop watching or listening to the media, excepting Telesur. Because, by the way, at the hotel there is no Telesur broadcasting, but rather range of scandalous media. Don't read either the Chinese press. Read the India Times that that says a number of things that make your hackles raise. We're almost on the verge of the end of 100 centuries of Western hegemony, and we are moving through a transition that is not going to be a smooth phase. These transitions have happened through wars, and we expect that the wars that we may be facing will not be too horrendous. Because if there is another word, we would be facing Armageddon. It'll be a thermonuclear final war. And this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Atilio, for your thoughts, geopolitical thoughts. That'll be certainly be much appreciated by our audience. And now we're going to turn it over to Emilia Reyes. She's a Mexican feminist. She has a master's and license degree in international relations and a master's degree in public management and government. She specialized in gender policy and budgeting and sustainable development budgeting, including disaster risk management, climate change. And in those fields, he has trained government officials in the judiciary, executive, and legislative powers in Mexico and regional United Nations agencies. She is presently a director for policy and budgeting for equality and sustainable development in gender equity. That's a civil society organization, a feminist civil society organization from Mexico. Thanks very much, Emilia. And you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thanks very much. And I'm very pleased to be here with you. I'm really honored for having been invited to join this panel because we share an approach to these main issues, but not only that, we all also have the passion and we have put our hearts in the same causes and the dream to transform this world. I wanted to share with you some of my concerns because I'm under the impression that just like the analysis in the media are old and insufficient to point to the issues that we must pay attention to, so are our analysis of social movements. We have to acknowledge that. We have to stand back and realize that we're doing the same kind of analysis that we had in the 70s or 80s, perhaps even the 90s, but we can no longer engage in the same kind of rhetoric. We just had the reports from the climate change panel, the International Climate Change Panel on mitigation that was published 2 or 3 months ago. There was a phrase that terrified us because that held that we only have until 2025 to keep the same level of greenhouse gas emissions level before we reach the maximum, before we reduce the emissions until 2030, if we want to remain below the 1.5 degrees mark, which is the minimum, or maximum rather, if we want to ensure the world's survival. A couple of months ago in the European Euro conference, I said that we only have 3 years to reconfigure completely our work and transform our entire economic setup. Just 3 years, but we were all wrong. I was wrong. Because in interviews with the scientist panel that were charged with the panel's drafting, and you know that the Intergovernment Climate Change Panel also negotiates line by line recommendations to decision makings, and the phrase that I said is that the latest 2020 study said that we should have already put a stop to the extraction, production systems that is the cause of the emissions, but that could not be included in a 2022 report that said that that objective should have already been accomplished 2 years earlier. So we could not continue thinking about a future where the scenario was catastrophic. We don't even have the constellation that is as an ecofascist idea that humanity would be destroyed, but life would be preserved, because what science is telling us, based on their scientific outcomes, is that the 9 world limits are now all being reached and overreached, because the destruction of the world's climate will entail the destruction of all the other planets' frontiers. By destroying the stability of the ecosystems, we are destroying the water balance, will increase the solidity of oceans, and we will surpass the limits of plastic and chemicals and contamination that are leading to a transformation and even the extinction of life and species. But there is a chemical process that I understand very well that has to do with the fact that the degradation of biodiversity, if we continue along this road, is going to create more aerosols that will eventually destroy the ozone layer. Remember, back in the 80s, it was so hard to rebuild the ozone layer, but if that is destroyed, and ECOF has to say that if life will continue even if we destroy mankind, but that will not be so, because the damage is so huge that the extinction of human life will be happening in 2040. 2040. Some say that this is not so, that we still have another 60 years ahead of us. But even if it were 60 years, even if it were 100 years, I'm horrified that we still think, analyze things like nothing's happening, that we're blind and deaf to the analysis that's in front of us. Those of us who are on the left. I mean, that right-wingers may be science deniers, but we have an ethical commitment to follow scientific research and reports, and this group, and I'm not saying the social movements that we all belong to are not listening to, and we're leaving it to the environmentalists, but they do not have the kind of knowledge that you have, because what we know is that the bottom of environmental degradation, what we find is a capitalist, extractivist, predatory movement that predates on natural resources and work, labor. We are leaving the environmentalist movements to wage this battle without the weapons they need. Do you know what they're asking the IMF? Is a green conditionality that will only exacerbate colonialism, and they're asking to put in place innovative financing tools in Latin America. And you know what, public-private partnerships, the green bonds, the debt tools. This is what the environmentalists are saying, that are desperate to recover the planet. But even more so, we know that if we could stop climate change tomorrow, all these 9 planet frontiers that have been exceeded to such an extent that devastation is imminent, annihilation is imminent. So I want to make a call that right now we redesign our entire strategy. We have to admit that we were wrong, that we didn't have the same actors as our main target. We cannot continue focusing on working at the local level, because unfortunately we have huge global challenges. The global south is going through a permanent emergency, and our local work requires that we put a lot of our efforts in the local emergencies. But you are more aware now than ever that the emergency agenda is not a transformation agenda. We cannot remain at the level of local emergency agenda. We have to think in structural terms locally. We have to be able to map them well, to know which ones they are, but those structural local transformations are not the transformations that'll change the macro structures. And we know that clearly, and that is the level that we have to pay attention to collectively, because it is not just a matter of addressing the issues of the mining company that operates in Peru and in Honduras, because eventually they will move to Vietnam or they will go to Colombia. We're aware of that, but we cannot. On the one hand, we cannot just focus on the local level, thinking that a local mobilization will suffice. And on the other hand, we are aware that we cannot make the committed level like an ideal, because it's going to be a fractal that reproduces all the structural differences at the local level. So that is a challenge for our movements, of our work from the viewpoint of a Latin American left, because we tend to idealize grassroots movements and community movements. But even if we could imagine that they have this transformative capacity, which is something that we would very much like to have, but we must be aware that the enemy is not in our territory. Now that we are discussing the United Nations climate change framework, a scientist from the IPCC said that in all the scenarios that we have prepared as we move forward, we have not taken account of the three factors. The first one, we do not have a single, in any of these scenarios, the future economic shock. Capitalism will result in or will go through an economic shock. Secondly, we are not taking into consideration any new pandemics or economic crisis. 100 years from now, none of these scenarios is taking account of those. And thirdly, no IPCC report takes account of the existence of a financial sector. Movements are now demanding finance for 100-year losses. If you are not aware of this, we can explain. But basically, what we're talking about is a damage or repairs agenda, and that's billions of dollars, and they're right. But this is not going to go through official government assistance. That we're going to be solving the issue of climate change finance. And you're aware of that. It is not only a colonial way of thinking, but there are a number of macro implications running behind it. But that is the greatest demand from the global south in terms of the climate change. In other words, we want funds to flow southwards rather than change the extractive dynamic that is devastating the world. There's no analysis of the world's financial structure that will account for the conditions in the systemic refinancing, government financing, budget, fiscal agenda analysis, because the environmental agenda does not include those things, and those things pertain to us, to this group, but we have not responded to that. Even my feminist, the structural Latin American agenda that's deep down in my heart has been anthropocentric. We are still talking about a national care system that, no matter how sophisticated that may be, does not pay attention to taking care of a life in the comprehensive, integrated way that would require that, in the first place, for women to be better caregivers forever, and caregivers for the Mother Earth. And without the naturalizations, and also our feminist movement has committed a sense of getting so far into the identity debate that we have forget about the structural debate that require from us more than ever, not just to safeguard the existence of humankind itself in 1 or 2 generations, but rather life in the planet, the health of the planet. We have not have sat down to humbly discuss these things. I want to invite this group to do so, and it hurts deep down. And I was at the Oradell conference, and I told them, you are so inefficient because it's your country, it's your decision makers, your protection patterns that are creating this situation, and we are feeling the impacts in the global south. And it hurts me to say so here and now that we all share these impacts. Organized crime is taking our nations. There's armed conflict that are part also of that change, and that is why it hurts so much to talk to you like this, because I am aware that we are living of this adding up of these emergencies that are a consequence of the macro system that we have not dived into, because we are trapped in our immediacy and perhaps in our feeling of not being able to do enough. And this is where I appeal to our huge capacity to call, to mobilize the people. And in this particular group, there's a particular ethic mandate. It's the technical work that we have to engage in to find macro solutions. Micro will not suffice, and there are many, many proposals, like, for instance, to put a limit to extractions that goes hand in hand with greenhouse emissions, because extractivism is what is devastating ecosystems, and also is the source of the greatest greenhouse effect gases. And the energy transition requires a greater extraction of minerals. And where are those? They are in Chile, they're in Mexico, lithium, etc. They are in territories, and that is only going to contribute to further devastation of our ecosystems, and that is going to take us to the destruction of all life.
And when Norway says that they saved up to 80% of their forests, because the Norway companies are owners of 80% of the forests in Cambodia. And we know that. But we shouldn't remain with the illusion that our Latin American movements, our Latin American bloc, will be able to face this international debate. We need to make transnational alliances, and in my case, to keep the northern hemispheres as even the movements from the north. But we need to establish those type of dialogues. We need to make them more strategically put together. We need to map out really clear what we have, what are we missing, and beyond thinking that it's really important, this Latin American regional organization, and even more so with these new progressive administrations or bloc, won't be enough. So what do we require? And I'm betting on the strategy to take into account that we will always fail, because we will go back to it, and then we'll add up to our strategy, and then we go back to do this and that, because our struggle, our fight is one, first off, to the great capital, but that's moving around in different spaces than we move around, and we need to be more efficient in that matter. And that's where, from gender equality, we are backing it up. Yeah, we know that there's increase of wealth for rich people, but there's also a decrease of wealth of the not rich people. What does this different mapping mean, though? Well, we do follow up to different international processes in the macroeconomical stage, and that's why it's important to think that there is a corporate capture of the ONU women. They made an alliance with BlackRock, which is one of the financial agencies, the most perverse and evil ones, and ONU's like that. We lost them to them. So we need, and as a movement, we need to know where are we standing, what do we need to do now. And I'm saying it with all the ache of looking at that there's an intergenerational debt that we have with the young people, but the other debt that we have is with the indigenous movement. We have 6% of the planet. with them, and they are subsidizing our life because they subsidize air, they subsidize 80% of biodiversity, and the rest of the Occident has been in charge of destroying it all. We live thanks to what our indigenous population are subsidizing for us. And this is implicated in Latin America with so many indigenous communities to reset the dialogue that we've had with our own indigenous population. We need to establish it and set it up in a manner that is not extractive, but that will still have something that we technically call traditional knowledge, which is the practical or the practice or the macro practice, which is most effective in the world so far to preserve life. And we don't know, with all technology, intelligence, and solidarity, we weren't able to link with our own indigenous population so they can ensure environmental safety. So those are the things that I wanted to share with you. And as you can see, this is something that moves me quite a lot, and I'm really concerned about this. And I'm saying that from the bottom of my heart. We need to be as critical as we can, the most radical criticism to our own practices, to our strategies. And I still want to think that we have hope. There's still hope for us. We do know the source of the problem, and by knowing that, the strategy keeps on going. We need to follow the strategy and solidarity, and that's what we have even to give. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Emilia. It's really impressive, all this data that you mentioned. Now it's the turn of Alirio Uribe. He's a Colombian attorney for the human rights defense, and he directed the collective of attorneys Jose Aldea Restrepo, with which the Peruvian civil society, especially the human rights community, has worked with quite a lot. And currently he's going from the human rights world to the political world, which is rather interesting. Currently he's a representative from the Congress Chamber of Colombia for Bogota. Alirio has worked international and in national court and legal systems in this international and universal system for human rights, and has been spokesperson in the platform of peace and human rights in Colombia. Anyways, Alirio is a man of peace. But Alirio, also you have 20 minutes, and especially you come from Colombia that has lived a huge and impressive party yesterday, never seen before. And let me retake Emilia's last phrase. It opens up hope for us. So thank you very much, and go ahead, Alirio. Thank you very much, Carlos. I would like to salute and congratulate the Latin American Network and Society Latindadd Network. A warm greeting to the Prosecutions Network of Latin America and Caribbean, because of this opportunity of being here, this opportunity of being here in person, one day from our opposition of our government for hope in Colombia. We would like to congratulate and salute our friends and panelists, and appreciate the invitation. We will look at this subject a bit from the Colombian side, or from the Colombian view. Colombia has historically been going in the contrary of Latin American story. Yesterday, and after 200 years, we had an alternative government setting up, a popular government, a social government. And I'm here also because I'm here to ask you for help to so many bright minds that we have in these networks and these platforms. And starting out from there, it would be really interesting that we could, as soon as we can, we could do an international summon in the with the Colombian Congress and the different stages, so we can debate on the exchange for the debt, where you are specialists in debt per peace, or debt per climate, or debt per social justice, per reparation of victims. So it would be really interesting that we could help out in the generation of these box that we call for social reform. If we make a forecast, and we have Colombian experts here that handle this topic quite well, If we do a forecast of the upcoming 4 years of budget, maybe 1 year is already spent in service of the debt. And obviously, we have 57.2 pip debt that will go over 753 million pesos in Colombia. Now, the tax and reform that we are setting up nowadays in Colombia to generate that fund, it's 50 million pesos. So if we apply, or we were to apply, exchange of debt at 20% will be generating 60, 70 billion pesos in Colombia for the changes that we are establishing or setting up. And why are these social changes necessary in Colombia? Because we've been over 50 years of non-compliant agreements, of non-listening to those nobodies in Colombia. Over 50 years of social, political violence and armed conflict. And we have now a government that's committed to solutions that the country requires. So it will be rather interesting to have within this inter-American proposal that you manage. We could think also about if Lula makes it to the Brazilian administration, and with all of the alternative governments that we have in the region, we can make it feasible and possible to have this Latin American integration and Caribbean integration that will allow us to face crises. Crises are common. Colombia has always had same crises across the region, worsened by the war, by armed conflict, by violence, but we've always been following up with the energetic crisis, food crisis, environmental crisis, and all the problems that we have. That's why I believe, and I'm sorry to speak so bluntly, the pandemic helped out Colombia somehow. Whenever we are within four walls, and this is the first international seminar that I'm participating after the pandemic, but I was always thinking about if the pandemic was going to make us better or worse, if the pandemic was going to face us with all the global challenges, if the pandemic was going to allow us to be more solidarian type of human beings and understanding the importance of the environment, of health, how important solidarity is. We also understood the public importance. We understood the importance for the governments and states to play a role to validate global crises. But we also were afraid that to see if the pandemic could lead us to a war, to mistrust, to become more selfish. And we've seen enemies in everyone else rather than us, because when we were going out to the street, we were afraid of people looking at us, approaching us, or touching us, or if they were coughing, we would run away from that. There was an era of non-solidarity because fear was installed in our society. And I believe that Colombia, this pandemic crisis, allowed us to connect. And for people to connect with the daily problems, hunger, lack of health, the death of the poorest, because the people that died the most across the world due to the pandemic were the poor people. They were unprotected. And I believe that in Colombia, that also took us to the streets to mobilize over 20,000 mobilizations during the government that just ended up in Colombia this week. In over 850 municipalities out of 100 or 1,100. So basically the whole country moved around. And they wanted to see changes. They wanted to be heard. They wanted to move the way that the whole humanity is moving on now, in a way for governments to react and provide solutions. In Colombia, the nobodies, those people that were never seen, that were never heard, got organized, they moved, and they expressed themselves politically. They voted. the Afro community, the indigenous community, farmers, young people, people that were carrying dead people, people that were solving hunger, people that were harvesting our lands, the academic world. Sons were out in the streets, and we started losing fear and walking out again without fear, and nobody's woke up with their muddy feet, bare feet. And we also learned how to take care of our vote. That was something important in Colombia. The election surveillance that we did to the Congress even, we recovered 4 senators that weren't seen in the pre-counting of the previous elections, so we were able to see how important vote counting and carrying and for your votes is, and how important it means, how important it is for the nobodies. So we have a lot of expectation in Colombia regarding the changes that might take place in public policies and legal reforms, constitutional reforms. And there's a huge interest into building popular power. The historical pact is born out of a process of encounter of many political movements, and they need to have a broad front, just as you had in Uruguay. I know that we have people from Uruguay here, and we want to work on that popular power, on those local governments and this regional agreement for peace in Colombia. I believe that yesterday Gustavo Petro, the president, said it quite clear that total peace is a strategic task, care for grandparents, for children, making or building a ministry for equality, and making this whole roadmap of social dialogue. I believe that people and communities do know the problems and they do know the solutions. And if there's many ways out locally, I believe that changing the system and changing to this energetic transition, as Gustavo Petro mentions, to be the core of his government, going from extractivist economy to a life type of economy. That's what he proposes, and that implicates that for Colombia to stop being the mining locomotive that decides plans of development of Uribe, of Santos, and obviously that is the core of the matter. How are we going to save the planet if we don't have governments that are compromising themselves to change the energetic matrix, to generate hydrological justice, to generate, to look after these alternatives? So I believe that it's easier in local governments to make waste management, for example. It's easier in local governments to think about alternative energy, to think in agroecology, to think about the food sovereignty. In a country where we have 21 million Colombians that are not eating 3 times a day anymore. And that is a part of this programmatic agenda that's just got to power in Colombia. And we are afraid, of course, we are afraid of not being able to respond to those expectations that people have. Obviously, we are really fearful as well of international pressure. We are afraid of international community doesn't understand what does it take to finish to end up in the war on drugs, and then going changing to an anti-drug policy, looking at health, consumption, addiction, like for example consumption of products that derive from cannabis or cocaine. What happened yesterday in Colombia was a real party and joyful celebration. This was not a protocol event. We had all the indigenous population, we had all the nobodies out there as special guests in the taking of the administration of the president. And we will work after this international agreement. We will work to comply it, and we want to pay that social debt, of course, and we want to work for the integration of Latin America. The Colombian constitution is quite clear in regards of the international policy should be focused in Latin American integration in the self-determination of people, in multilateralism, in protection itself of the environment. Gustavo Petro said quite clear the axles of the Colombian politics will be the diplomacy for peace and diplomacy for the mitigation of climate change, diplomacy for the defense of equality, and at the policy or internal policy level we need to reorganize the territory, the land in function of water. In Colombia, the territories were organized with lead, basically, with more than 8 million Colombians deployed, with massacres, with murders of social leaders, with forced disappearances. So we will have to reorganize the country in function of life and in function of protecting basins, waters, bodies of water, the Amazon. All of these proposals are nowadays in our government's proposals, and it was incredible for us as a social movement and as a society to see that the alternative candidate and the counter candidates of Petro were placing in their social agenda our agenda. Basic rent, no, the not to fracking, and all of these environmental matters, defense to life, defense to human rights, defense to communities, they became a political agenda, a part of the political agenda in Colombia. That was unthinkable. The people in civil society was never reflected in the government proposal from presidential candidates. Now, and in this last time, the Colombian civil society was able for that agenda to actually be imposed. The economic or financial reactivation, the employment generation, parity in the participation in the Congress, to look after all women to be included in the government, and for women to be with the government, and for women to rule, for them to be able to build our public policies too. So I believe that type of, or those big global topics are nowadays in the mindset of the Colombian government, and also in the mind of those that will be in Congress to work and to try and make Colombia a world power. Maybe my speech is not so academic, but what I'm asking you to think is that just look at all of these entities in the Latin American network. We need to try to put these agendas, all of our agendas, into our own public policies in Latin America. If we have alternative governments or administrations, these type of ideas, and the way that it was established in this form, we need to take them and we need to make them public policies. What Petro did was not an organization of political parties. What Petro did wasn't to organize crowds, to organize movements, to propose the politics of love, or the policy of love as a vital policy, so he can move society, to move the crowds towards the common good of the humanity, to try and to have individual and collective desires to be reflected in this politics, in this policy of love that we mentioned, which is the one that you also defend, the love of life, love to others, and the love to everything surrounding us. And Frank, as an Afro woman and as a victim of violence in Colombia, she added up the component of living nice. And we work upon human rights towards that same mean, to live nice, to live really good, without fear, or without tyrannies or oppression, without exclusion, without women being fearful in their private world, in their public world, in their school, in the systems of health, in their couple's life. Living nice and living sweet is a life philosophy. It live with dignity, living with rights. And for Afro populations, for ancestry population. Living sweet and nice is also a spiritual type of organization model. Yeah, it's a spiritual organization for social, for financial scope, for their cultural side. It's living in harmony with their social surroundings, with their natural surroundings, with people, with nature. Under that same logic, I would like to say that we're really optimistic about this in Colombia because we understand the global problems and we want to open space. And if the war and the pandemic has opened space for the millennium objectives and has opened the room to face all the challenges, to face the energetic crisis, the impact that it has. And that's why it's important that to be here thinking about this and thinking about that these networks in Colombia need to communicate with one another to establish a government or administration, like as we said, that it's not only political rhetoric, but actually to be translated into changes. And that's why we need to establish this type of dialogue with different governments in the region so we can make a Latin American integration in function of the challenges that we are facing. We all need to face and surpass hunger and recover the time that we lost in education. Connectivity now becomes a challenge, a fundamental human right. In Colombia, we heard that the kids were going to school virtually, but it's not like that all the way, because in the cities we only had 50% of coverage, and in the rural side we didn't even have coverage. In educational terms, we actually went back in time. And now with artificial intelligence, like Atilio mentioned before, we are in a fourth industrial revolution with quantum computers and with all this technology that can slave us if we do not regulate it. Social control, the intervention of technologies. We can now print a house up. We can make a 3D printing of a house, or we can transport 360 tons with a drone. We have a huge amount of changes in robotics. Countries such as Korea are planning on having more robots than human workers in the upcoming decades, and that has to make us think. You work for your basic income, for your basic wage. Now we're looking at these technologies. We need to use them to serve communities that have lost their employment. All this tax and justice, or financial and social justice, is the center of our post-pandemic focus, is the core for the changes that we need to take and we need to make happen to neutralize that corporate analysis, the way that we set up here and we explain here, not just in national scenarios, but also in international scenarios, in multilateral scenarios. So the interests of companies are not imposed upon the humanity's interest. In conclusion, for us in Colombia, we are living a unique moment. We're living an irrepeatable moment. We're living a moment that for the first time a president of the republic is compromising, committing to protect the land, seas, oceans, rivers, biodiversity, to face deforestation, to promote clean energy, and to build upon a society that's peaceful. So that's why I'm here to tell you that we are really happy, but also that facing these challenges, knowledge and your ideas are vital. And we have that scenario to open up. So I'm committing myself to organize this event with the Colombian Congress, with the expertise and all of your knowledge as well, so you can help us to think how can we make this local hub of work, like for example the exchange for taxes that we mentioned, and how in the SALAP framework of CARICOM or from UNASUP or whatever we define, maybe even the Sao Paulo Forum and the multilateral scenarios that we are going to be working on. And if it's possible for Latin America to live sweet and nice and to surpass exclusion, poverty, and inequality that the pandemic left, and that the war is now leaving us with all the lack of fertilizers and food scarcity that's going around the world. And we hope that now we can, I hope that we are now focusing onto a war, or a new war, even with the US and Ukraine and whatever is happening in international scenarios. Thank you very much, and thank you for your invite.
Thank you very much, Alirio, and we're going to take your word for that about that event that you're proposing to organize in the Colombian Congress. We could even organize something that it'll be not just a debate with Colombian Congress members, but also invite Congress members from Latin American and the Caribbean countries to socialize this mechanism. We have worked a lot on debt swaps. That was criticized. It was a very polemicized by some movements that we did not owe anything and we should pay nothing, but we created research. It was an effective mechanism at a point in time. And this mechanism to swap debt for social expenditure, as President Petro mentioned yesterday, seems to be an interesting option that deserves at least being debated about. Now it's the turn for Ariela Ruiz Caro to take the word. She's a Peruvian economist with a graduate degree from Humboldt University from Berlin on economic integration processes from the University of Buenos Aires. She's a Claxo Ecolac member, and she writes in La República's Daily Lima and El Cohete from Buenos Aires. She's been an official at the Andean Community, an advisor to Mercosur, Peru's economic advisor in the Peruvian ambassador in embassy in Buenos Aires. And over to you, Ariela. You have now 20 minutes for your to share your thoughts. Thanks very much to the Latindadd and the Fiscal Justice. Sí.
Ya. Y de compartir.
And for allowing me to share with you this on this very interesting topic that for this seminar after the pandemic, the war. And if you were fortunate tellers, in addition, the war issue has become even more severe. Being the last to speak has some disadvantages because it is hard to add on what has already been said, but already. But there is always something else that can be added and perhaps underscore some ideas. The pandemic has evidently evidenced the weakness of the economic model in Peru. We have experienced the largest number of excess debts due to the pandemic, and it has already evidenced the veracity of the pharmaceuticals when it came to the vaccines issue, and also how they govern above the authorities that have finance, and particularly in developed countries. And moreover, one of the questions that has been proposed for this seminar is where the region is headed, and I think that there's some hope that was that emerged towards the end of last year, because The truth is that the last 2 or 3 years, our region has traveled backwards in terms of convergence and coordination in the international scene. For instance, back in 28, Duque committed to destroy UNASUR, and he did so. Soon thereafter, however, 8 countries joined UNASUR and denounced in an agreement that was very important. It is true that in recent years, with the changing administrations, like with the Macris in Argentina, there were a couple of years of a very irrelevant participation. Bolivia and Venezuela, I think, made a mistake of rejecting a Macri's proposal as Secretary General of UNASUR, and the organization remained headless. So that created the pretext and the opportunity to denounce, because since there was no Secretary General, what was the purpose of it? And UNASUR had been a very important organization because it was not proposed as a trade integration organization, but as a political forum that had a very important role and impact in the attempt to that was manifested in the Santa Cruz, Bolivia events, and questioning Colombia's idea to set up military bases. UNASUR was able to call an international presidential conference of all South American countries excepting Peru's. Peru's president at the time was Latin America. That was Alan Garcia was Peru's president at the time, but he sent his foreign minister. But the idea was, and finally, UNASUR was dissolved with the setting up subsequently of FORSUR, and a totally irrelevant organization that has not performed any kind of important role, nor does it have a constitutional agreement like UNASUR did. Then 2020 at the IDB, we allowed Mauricio Claver-Caroni to rise to the chair of that organization. That was a really shameful act. Argentina, Mexico, Chile, and Costa Rica tried to block the quorum necessary to appoint UNASUR's president. Only 1.5% of votes were necessary that are held by Spain and Peru, who would define who would be IDB's chair. But at the end of the day, Mexico, that held 70% of the power to vote, stepped back, and finally Mauricio Claver-Caroni was appointed as chairman, and he was in charge of setting the rules and making decisions. And where Guaido's representative, that's Ricardo Hasman, was still represented instead of the Venezuelan government. Another huge thing was the failure of Latin America's region to speak up and support of India and South Africa and the World Trade Organization, specifically in concern of intellectual property rights connected to trade issues, when India and South Africa proposed in October 2020 to release the patents for the vaccines that were about to be started to be produced during the pandemic. And the South African Union, 54 countries with speaking different languages and holding different ideas and ideologies, jointly supported that proposal. And then Latin American, and this is something that was mentioned yesterday by Gustavo Petro in his inaugural speech, failed to make a pronouncement or engage in any kind of coordinations or do joint purchases of these vaccines. The sub-regional Latin American countries like the Andean Community, CARICOM, and the Andean Community, and the Central American Integration Secretariat do have the kind of platforms that are needed for joint purchases, but they're not put to work. So these three events were the low points of region-wide coordination, but after that comes hope. And I think that Colombia, the elections in Colombia open a very important path forward, because Colombia has always been the cleft in important issues in Latin America. Back in the 1980s, in the Latin American economic system, CELA made a proposal to renegotiate foreign debt based on joint guidelines, like setting top rates and repayment debts. A number of shared guidelines for all countries to renegotiate their debt. But Colombia, because they never renegotiated their debt, because they were able to always manage it, always proposed these proposals that never came until the Brady Plan and the Washington Consensus, and the privatizations came in the 1990s, and countries quote-unquote solved their debt issues, which of course was not solved, and the consequence of which we can see now. Colombia is a turning point in building future hope, but that comes from before, actually, because one of them was the slow death of the Lima Group. The Lima Group was set up back in 2017 because the countries of the OAS could not condemn the Colombian government, and they came up with the idea that with friendly countries, the Lima Group could be set up, but that gradually crumbled. AMLO, Mexico's president, stopped attending the meetings in 2018, and then Alberto Fernandez from Argentina also prepared a very harsh letter where he said that the only thing that was being accomplished with this Venezuelan bloc countries was to make the Venezuelan people suffer even more. And nor did he believe in a group that would encourage the Venezuelan armed forces to recognize a different president, that this new interim president would become a member, or was a member of the Lima Group. So what kind of intermediation could be engaged in if Juan Guaido was a member of the Lima Group? Then Pedro Castillo was elected in Peru. Perhaps one of the few things that he accomplished as an initial act of government was to stop attending those meetings, although those meetings were actually not being held anymore. There were no Lima Group meetings anymore because Guaido had lost institutional support. When the new Venezuelan Congress was elected, Guaido became an ordinary citizen like myself or most of you. He did not have any institutional foundation to be recognized anymore as interim Venezuelan president, so much so that the European Union has failed to recognize him, although the U.S. has, which really is something hard to believe, to say the least. After that, the Pacific Alliance that was set up back in 2011 to cast a shade on UNASUR, and Mercosur organization was a lot more coherent and where Venezuela at that time was a member of, now has almost basically vanished, although they still organize summits, but they're totally irrelevant. The 4 members of the Pacific Alliance, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico, had signed free trade agreements. They were the most successful countries, so to speak, in Latin America that everybody had take as an example. But these 4 countries, and in particular Chile, Colombia, had experienced social upheavals, a turmoil that you're all aware of in 2019. And these 4 countries have now chosen left-leaning administrations. Regardless of how these administrations are moving, you know that in Peru we're going through a very serious political crisis, but the people chose to change these models that were presented as exceptional models for development. The Pacific Alliance now that is under wraps, and whereas the CELAC, the Latin American and Caribbean Community, starts to have some relevance after a few years where it has remained in the shadow. And a few years ago, the Mexican president organized a CELAC meeting and invited Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and he managed to convene many participants. The mere fact of having organized it and having been able to discuss the food sovereignty and health sovereignty were important feats in themselves. Moreover, for that year, the America Summit had been scheduled for that year. Convened by the United States. The technical secretariat is held by the OAS. Typically, it was it met every 3 years, but it was postponed, and it could only organized just last June in LA. But that summit was an absolute failure. We could even say that it doesn't make any sense to hold these America Summit meetings. It was born in 1994 through the apex of the Washington Consensus Initiatives, and mostly because that's when the Hemispheric Energy Initiative was proposed, so that Latin Americans' oil and gas would be open through ALCA and free trade agreements in the corresponding investments chapter that bans restricting investments or limiting exports, or to build internal production chains. In other words, that investments would be free to access without restriction to natural resources. Since that year until now, we have seen the gradual loss of importance of the Summit of the Americans, and the only idea that came from the U.S. was an alliance to strengthen it, which is a repeat of the America Grows initiative that was launched in 2019, and the only country, or one of the few countries that got any loans from that initiative was precisely Colombia, at the time when Mauricio Caroni, and a national security advisor to the Trump administration, visited Colombia so that the Colombian government would become a platform to persuade all Latin American and Caribbean countries not to oppose Mauricio Caroni's appointment to the chair of the IDB. So the America Grows Initiative only sought to detour Chinese or block Chinese investments in Latin America. I will lend you money, but you must not accept YY investments or limit Chinese investments in airports and ports and other kinds of infrastructure. So basically, the idea was to restrict the Latin Americans' sovereign decisions that must be made as in a function of their own interests, but not on what is the U.S. dictum. Another important gesture that is a demonstration of sovereignty is that the recent, about 3 months ago, Mercosur summit, it was not allowed Zelensky to gave a conference, and I think that was the right decision. But I wonder what's got to do the Mercosur summit with a Zelensky's conference at that forum. The other important, interesting event was that in the 15th Defense Ministers Conference of the Americas that takes place every couple of years, and that took place a couple of weeks last week. Argentina and Chile observed the concept of preventive dissuasion. That is the new concept that has been introduced by the U.S. and NATO in the last June summit of that organization. That is a step forward, and as is the fact that Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, even Brazil, have objected or observed the declaration. They did not assign a very harsh condemn towards Russia's intervention in Ukraine. I think that we are all in agreement that that war is not right, but we have also to understand why the invasion, intervention, military operation, whatever you might call it, actually took place. Because behind all this, there is, as has been already said here, the veracity of the military-industrial complex, and this is the huge issue that is behind what's happening in Ukraine and also in Taiwan. We cannot be so naive to think that Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was the result that her role as a defender of democracy and freedoms, or that the Pentagon just provided an escort so that she would arrive there safely, and that there was nothing that Biden could do, because in the kingdom of democracy, the balance of powers is fully respected. I don't think that we can be so naive as to believe that what happens is that after the disastrous abandonment of Afghanistan by the U.S., another war is needed, and also because this is the military-industrial complex that governs the U.S. as do the pharmaceuticals and the oil corporations that have tried to push Russia away from Europe, to interrupt the flow of gas on the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, and that has led Europe to follow blindly the U.S. Stopping gas flows through that pipeline has been an objective of the oil corporations lobby for several years, that objected Western companies to take part in building this pipeline, because the U.S. oil corporations wanted to export liquid petroleum gas in their tankers, which is a lot more expensive and polluting than the exports of gas to Europe by the pipeline. So basically, this is the international scenario where today I think Latin Americans has the possibility after Petro's ascent to power in Colombia to hold a more coordinated position, and President Petro has talked about that. He has given, he has made a call for Latin America's integration, of the importance of having a greater, in terms of climate change and green energies and in health issues. So I think that this opens a window of hope. There is a loss of a presence of the United States in our region for the reasons that I just discussed. And I think that if we are divided, we will be defeated together. As Heraclitus said before Christ. And this is the end of my presentation. Thanks very much, Ariela.
I think it's been a really complete panel with really complementary views of things. So now we'll open the mic for a small Q&A session, or a short Q&A session. As you know, time slips away from us, but we'll take 3 questions from the audience. And the first one was from Graciela Rodriguez, Guillermo Borneo, and then, but well, let me ask you something else. I'll ask to those people using the mic, come forward to the podium. Please, Graciela, come forward. There's a mic there. This podium thing is not so nice, but let's do this. I'd like to ask, I'll have questions for all of you, but I'm not allowed to, so. I wanted to ask, how do you understand or include in your excellent presentation the raising of new rights in the new context of degradation of the North American hegemony, and or a bit of the concept of Aquile Membe of necropolitics? Where are we going? Where are we walking by? I wanted to know a bit more about how do you understand that Russian-Chinese interaction and the perspectives of Brexit, etc. But I don't know if you have the time with all the questions that we will have. For the Senator of Colombia, we are living in Brazil, the perspective of the Lula elections, and we have huge problems like you had and like you do now. And I would like to ask you as well a couple of things, such as how do you think to deal with the illegality network that the paramilitarism left behind, and because it's a really huge problem, how much it extends to in the economy, in its economy of illegality in Brazil, and how is that going to be able to, or how is the perspective on the road that we should go through, or maybe thinking about studies, or maybe think about it all together, but also the challenges of the creation of a broad front, which is another problem that we have in Brazil, where the Vice, which was a candidate for the right in the last election, and they weren't able to get him anyway. So how, as a challenge, and how to face this problem that you do have also with the broadness of alliances now? Thank you very much, Graciela, and thank you for keeping it short for 3 minutes. Guillermo, 3 minutes, please. Yes, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity of allowing me to ask one precise, specific question. First off, we've received a landscape, a global and regional landscape, but it calls to my attention something. We know that the U.S. considers Latin America as their backyard, and they've done what they wanted, right, with Latin America. But in the analysis that we've heard, the grandeur or the magnitude of the war that they are under now, and that they've been for the last 3 decades, and that the effects of it on us, the war against drugs. We need to just look at Mexico, Colombia, Central America, and South America. So the so-called war against drugs is, like he said, is the backyard that they have us hanging from, because all of the armies depend on the North American politics. So they made us go after this criminal war that withholds and covers all Latin America, and the value and the consequences that it has on our people, it's only a number for them. So it's important, and I heard President Petro's speech, and I'll read it, but as our Senador and colleague from Colombia said, it's important, and I believe it's important that this event that's been summoning on, basically a self-summoning type of thing for Colombia, we need to stop this so-called war against drugs. Thank you, Mr. Diego Borneo. We have Diego Borneo, Peruvian activist. And now we have Alejandro Villamar from Remark, Mexico. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you very much. I have two questions, one for Atilio and one for Caro. How is it that, or how can we understand in this auditorium that the financial crisis subject, internationally speaking, as one of the key characteristics of the crumbling of many paradigms and mechanisms, and for it not to be a fundamental axle for the perspective, not just worldwide, but for Latin America? And the second question would be, by the speech, it might seem like CELAC, or the one that we've been committing to with our organizations, doesn't appear as part of that hope. So how do you explain that position from our speaker? Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you, Alejandro. We'll now open the mic to a second round, or unless there's one more individual that wants to ask one question. We've asked questions about, or general questions for Atilio, for Ariela. Please go ahead, Georgina. And we close it out there. Thank you. Thanks to, and this is for a Mexican colleague, how are we able to articulate alliance processes locally, regionally, and globally? And why is it fundamental? I believe that we do a lot of mobilization and incidency and appropriation and raising awareness in the territory, in our territory or in our sector. But we need to focus our strategic goals, globally speaking, where decisions are made. And that's something that we're missing. Thank you very much, Georgina. You have your questions now, and we'll open to only a 5-minute round of answers. Okay, so we'll start in that same order. Atilio? You use that other mic, I think it's better. All right, thank you. Thank you for those questions. I believe that in regards of what Graciela asked from Brazil, the legislation of the U.S. has a financial component, but it also has a huge political component. The Brazilian political system that was introduced, or I was formed in the traditional academia with the fundamental models. I always read that Latin America needs to overcome the dispersion of political parties to trying to avoid the North American model of parties going towards the center with a normal curve of opinion that's not too lefty or too righty. So that initiative establishes a corrupt crisis. Trump, which is a bandit, basically had the audacity of pointing out that that system was being managed by criminals, and it has to do with what Ariela mentioned, the key of the industrial sector. Yeah, because we heard that in November there's an election, and she needs to keep her chair, and that's why she needs to keep the support from the Democratic candidate. So we're talking about a system deeply corrupt where the American citizen is so helpless as the Latin American citizen. You're not going to believe that the citizen has more information or even more capacities of influencing in the agenda of political parties. It's nothing like that. The agenda is established by the military industrial circle and of course big pharma, meaning all of the pharmaceutical industry that's made phenomenal earnings with the pandemic. And of course, the financial capital, because somebody was asking us, what happens, why is it not coming in? Well, what's being managed, it's being managed in a more on the down low, and the question will be why the financial capital is now so important in this current world, because that financing of capitalism, it goes against the capacity of production of the assets that the society needs. But it's only because the U.S. From the Vietnam War, they've been constantly in wars without increasing 1 cent on their taxes. So how is those wars were financed then? Well, asking money to Wall Street, and Wall Street facilitated that financial capital, and basically they financed those wars, and that made for the earnings of the financial capital were fabulous. So what is the political implication of this crisis, right? Of the political paradigmatic system of the U.S., this bi-party system that we just saw recently in January the 6th, when a crowd just entered the Congress. So we see that capital neoliberalism in this version has achieved a huge success by proving that in any human society there's corrupt sections and virtuoso sectors. Corrupt sectors are those around the government and the political processes. That's where corruption rules, the responsibility rules. And we have another sector which is completely preserved from it, which are markets, and these are the companies in the private sector. So getting into this sector, making politics, is coming into muddy waters, plagued with morality and criminals, and this has achieved a huge importance, and this is expressed on the ultra right side. And why has it been so successful then? Because of the extraordinary failure of capitalistic democracies. So whenever we take, for example, this country, Peru, was the first one starting transition from dictatorship to democracy, right? I think it was in 1982, or the first one, or 1980. Yeah, 1980 it was, okay. So then we had Argentina, Brazil, etc. But when you look at the numbers of inequality and social inequality in the Latin American countries, at the end of this dictatorship, and nowadays, 40 years after, of democratic exercise, the indexes are worse. The numbers are worse. They're really, really worse than at the beginning of this process. So what does it mean? Like a lot of young people say, and that I've spoken to across America, means that for them all of these democratic processes is fake. It's really hard for us to say that, but I will have to be some sort of preacher that democratic processes are the best, la la la. But the reality of it is that democratic processes, not just in Latin America, but also in Europe, they have no reason to have people in poverty or to have people really sick or in a really poor situation. In Germany, I just heard about it. I was shocked about it. In Germany, there's a research, it's not a tossed out number, there's 75% of people in German universities are there by annual contracts that are renewed. And there's some contacts appearing, mine and some other people that I don't know, but they told me about that. They told me about it. They told me that they didn't got their contracts renewed because they were in the same position as the university about the Russia-Ukraine war. And there were people that was like, okay, we can't just join this campaign to phobia against Russia. So if you think like that, you are going out. You're not staying here. So this is basically political or full political control. So facing that, many people rebels. And on the left, just as with Adam and Eve in the first day of creation, they're like looking around, going to finding out where they have to go. Are we capitalistic or not? Are we going to after imperialism or not? Or what do we do? So at the end of the day, they go with the extreme right, and that's what's happening. We can see that in many places. This will be a topic to speak out throughout the day, and I don't want to extend myself so much, but I just want to finish off with the success of culture that makes it nowadays that if you go to a suburb or a favela in Rio or to a villa in Argentina, or you go to a popular neighborhood in Soweto in South Africa or in Nigeria or in Korea or in a European city, you're probably going to see a group of young people dressing the same, eating the same, with the same sense of fashion, and they connect with the world through a smartphone. And of course, when you talk to them about politics and democracy, social justice, they have no idea of what we're talking about, and they are not interested. They are not waiting nothing from them. So if there's no left that picks up those outcries, they will be picked up by the extreme right, and what they do is to deepen into all the horrors of capitalism. But that's what sadly we have in our current landscape. Thank you very much, Atilio. Now we have Emilia Reyes. Thank you very much. First off, I would like to apologize to Ariela for going out. I'm taking a medication that messes with my temperature, and I had to leave so I can recover my strength or my temperature. I'm sorry, but I wanted to say that we need to stop looking at our own belly buttons. We need to stop talking about this in terms of Latin America, like if it was an isolated region, as if our movements or just making an isolated transformation, or even as if our own block capacity will be able to change something in the world. And not even G77, the full G77 can change any of the global dynamics that we are currently living under. That's not the truth. So China, with all of it that we can say about them, well, China with G77, it's not able to move towards or move any scenario either. So we need to look at it and we need to put into the limelight, because it's not a matter of the U.S. versus the rest. I mean, we need to go beyond those schemes that we are explaining ourselves into an international reality through the part of the governments, and now we need to see that there's not only 1%, that it doesn't mean people, that doesn't mean entities, but these are dynamics and flows. That's what we talk about the financial sector, and we talk about not of the monetary dimension or financial dimension of money itself, but the normative dimension of these flows in this type of global financial architecture. And that's something that we need to start linking ourselves more clearly. And I think that Latin America has an ache, and the problem is that we have idealized a lot of this idea, and this is the bloc that is the most progressive bloc of G77. We know that, and they are the ones that have led huge initiatives such as the new right to a healthy environment, to a safe environment, sustainable environment. But again, I would like to insist on the fact that we have 3 subsidies in the world, because we cannot speak about capital or capitalism. We have 3 subsidies, or 3 types of subsidies: the division of the geography and our work, which means that the global south is financing, subsidizing the global north. This is through this whole depredation of the world. The extinction of life in the world is being developed in our land, and we don't have a way of moving from there. 2 is a subsidy of the sexual division at the workplace that make women work at their household in a not remunerated or not paid manner, and this is something that affects global economies. And third, the indigenous population that I've already mentioned before. So I think that we should stop or leave aside this phenometric analysis. The phenometric is important to open space for detangle the structural side. What are the pillars? Where are or what is sustaining or what is tensioning or what is holding these dynamics that are ending up with life and that are putting at risk our well-being and that are increasing the presence of organized crime in our land. Anyways, in Mexico, you can see that, okay, the cenote died, the manglar died, and fishes died, but it's not something or an exclusive problem of Mexico. This is happening in all of our lands. So this is not a matter of going back to our previous tactics, or thinking that doing more and better we're going to obtain a transformation. Again, if we want to call it that, we don't have the same type of enemies. The dynamics are not the same. The dynamics are at this macro level that we see as a different animal, and they don't even go through our regional spaces or even our intergovernmental spaces. Democratically speaking, the United Nations. So we need to be really keen and we need to be bold to organize ourselves even better and more. So again, let's stop looking at our own belly buttons, because I'm not only talking about my region, but my sector, my topic, my agenda. We can't just work on that. And tomorrow we will have a round table on the financial architecture or international financial architecture, and I think that we will have a lot of things that are important there. We can't just fall behind and fall asleep. We can't think that somebody's going to come over and this environmentalist movement is not going to achieve it, because the debate is not for environmental spaces, because the debate exclusively is to work on this capitalistic system, extractive system, and that depredates so much to finish life. So the capital life tension that the pandemic has put upon us is 1,000,000 times bigger in this debate of saving lives in the planet. And we are not seeing this because we want to talk about the war and we want to talk about the pandemic, and that is phenomenon. This is not structural for us. Thank you very much, Emilia, for your message. It's really clear. Alirio, also 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
In regards of the broad front and political alliances, that is an issue that is being questioned very much in Colombia at this point in time, because power was conquered together with the establishment of powers and the appointment of various ministers in the government's leadership required alliances. The 14 political parties are represented in Congress, and all reforms have to go through Congress. Obviously, when we discuss a broad national accord that would allow to put a stop to the internal war and to imagine the kind of a country that we reach a pact upon, I think this is not something that the traditional bourgeoisie has been able to devise or to devise a path towards that objective, and to design a peace for the country. It is critical for Petro's and Francia's administration, critical, but there are risks there, but also it is important that there should be a strong governance, that there will not be a turn in a direction, and all the other issues are connected in Colombia. The internal conflict and the struggle against drug trafficking. And the present administration has it clear that a new strategy has to be adopted. And here we already have a red line that has been drawn by the U.S. government regarding the forced eradication of drug trafficking and their opposition to the peace agreement as a way to defeat drug trafficking and that focuses that has not focused on the fight against the value chain. And clearly, if we cannot defeat drug trafficking, it will be impossible to reach peace. Drug trafficking, cocaine is the main source of or the second main source of profits in Colombia. There's 270 million users around the world that exert a great pressure on drug production. And regulation of a drug trade can be a way out, but that requires international agreement. But we also have to talk to those illicit, illegal networks. We need to comply with the terms of the peace agreement. We have to talk to the political players and to make a proposal from the juridical side so that certain groups will fall into the fold of law and formalize huge amounts of capital, and making these illicit economies make legal would not be enough to solve the problem. Fostering commodities, crops like banana and corn will not be enough to replace the illegal economies and defeat the armed groups and reach a total peace. However, there's a past experience in this respect, and we will have to find a way to do this. But basically what we need to do is to reach a peace agreement, reach an agreement with the National Liberation Front, and if the illicit economies survive, they will be limited and operate under different conditions.
Well, I believe that in this institutionality, on international planetary institutionality, in different scopes, in the financial, in the food, intellectual property, and commerce, the presence of Latin America with a coordinated position is fundamental. I don't think that it'll be the best for the region for us to go, each one of us with separated or different positions, because at the end will be an irrelevant network. And that's what we've become, not just in the commercial side. Our participation in worldwide commerce is reduced more and more, but also in the diplomatic scope. In the political side, we've lost the capacity of proposal, and we are still in an automatic pilot from what the superpower demands. So in that sense, if we want to have our own voice in climate change also, That's what Petro and Boric are proposing. I think that that's really important to start from the regional. And in that sense, CELAC that I said in September of last year was going to be was going to take place in Mexico. The most important thing is that it had a huge summoning, but also the decisions that were made are important. Sovereignty in health and in the food sector. We've lost in Latin America our food sovereign with the with the FTAs, and we've only focused into buying subsidized products, and we've dedicated to export products that are not vital for development. And water consumers in the Peruvian case, for example, for avocado, and in Chile the same thing. So I think that we've established two important topics: health sovereign. We've talked about coordinating research project with Cuba that developed the only country that developed with their own technology a vaccine, or 3 vaccines actually. And that's what they've used to protect themselves from COVID. This is nothing little of a great, but in the media we don't see this. And why not spreading out the capacities that we have in Chile, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil in this scope? Because we've dedicated to buy everything, and we've lost our sovereign in 2 scopes of life, and living sweet and nice, if we want to call it something. So what is the next step for SELAC? Because this is a historic process, and we are approaching little by little as an exponential or logarithmic equation, but these are goals that you are reaching to. Alberto Fernandez in the Summit of the Americas announced that we're going to have the Summit of the Americas in November 2022 in Buenos Aires. He invited the president of CELAC in Buenos Aires, and he invited President Biden so he can attend, where they will strengthen these topics. Maybe we can add climate change, but I believe that if this current CELAC, not with the strength or the force that it should have, but I believe that the circumstances in Latin America are given to sort of encourage this, and also our exchange rate. Just like the Andean peso was at a point, there was a unit of currency that we used in a moment of financial restriction. So we can reevaluate these type of things. We need to retake certain things that were left aside because of the change of circumstances. It's not bad to retake or to reuse certain points. I think that's possible. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ariela. Thank you very much to our panel. Now we've heard really interesting ideas and forces. I'll allow myself to say one: in the era of hegemony of the Centro is in transit, especially the U.S. hegemony. We are in the middle of a transition that Atilio mentioned, but behind it there is a resistance, like Ariela mentioned, of the lobby and the industrial military complex, which is a stakeholder. We mentioned different stakeholders as well, but not just referring to states, as Emilia mentions. And a part of this reconstruction or rebuilding strategy of really thinking of sovereign decisions in Latin America to keep our financial relationships with China, for example, or with Russia, as we mentioned. An important thing is to retake the agenda of the structural problems. Emilia tells us about the attention to the capital of life, that we need to highlight the climate crisis, and we need to modify the way that we understand social movements, local and community, and rethink our part in function of assuming a technical mandate to find solutions that are concrete to the extraction system. A technical political mandate, actually. We need to be critical with our productive and capitalistic productive practices and respond to the depth with the indigenous movement. They have knowledge, that are way more effective to fight environmental degradation, and that was a really good idea. And all the two ideas is the election of Petro. It gives us hopes to have a climate and social agenda that will improve, and we all have expectations on that process. For Colombia and the motto of living sweet and nice, we also take it as a part of the event, and including progressive administration with important as our past extractive economy, and we hope that we are able to do it. And finally, we are proposing to organize an international encounter in Colombia that will gather the Congress and the government, actually, with congressmen from Latin America to talk about obtaining more resources and developing social reforms, responding to climate change and a series of needs of the region. We'll notate all of this, and we thank our editors team to get to this conclusion so fast. And now we'll go to a 15-minute break, and we come back with G1. There's outside a coffee break for you all. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Eran dos explicaciones, la de las 9 fronteras, pero también en qué escenario se hace también en qué escenario se hace
La pandemia ha golpeado a América Latina y el Perú. Al elevado número de muertes se suma la caída de la actividad económica y el desempleo, reduciendo la recaudación tributaria. La pandemia